All right, it's time. Let's get the party started. So thank you, everyone, although everyone is mainly uh, associate deans at this point. Um, Thank you for coming out for another episode of Academic Integrity Live here at SUNY Oswego. Uh, I've got some slides just to try to guide things along, but I, at least on Wednesday, I went through them very quickly so that we had most of the time for questions and answers. These were the points that I gave John for our agenda and the main things to consider. I I won't even bother with the why reporting matters because uh, if you have real questions about that, we can certainly address them, but I'm hoping that that's somewhat obvious. The important thing here is that we have moved away from violation reporting using Maxient, which is the system that Student Affairs uses. We, using the great skills of Andrew Buckman, have started using Starfish as a reporting platform, and reporting should be easy. It's everything else that's difficult involving having students do these sorts of things in their classes. The reporting part is something that we've tried very hard to make as easy as possible for instructors. The things that we really want instructors to do: number one, consult with the student. Um, we realize that some students are going to avoid contact, especially if it's an online class. It might be difficult to actually physically or remotely meet with them, but we strongly recommend that before you consider penalties, before you decide anything, that you talk to the student about what happened. Um, at some point in the process, it is useful, whether you are a new faculty member or a seasoned veteran, to talk to your department chair or program director about it. That is because if there is an appeal, they're going to get it. So if they have some foreknowledge, it is very helpful for them. Uh, Ultimately, you make a decision and you have to communicate that decision to the student. And, this is something that sometimes gets done verbally, but we would really like this to be a permanent record that you can say, on this date, I told you that you were failing this class. So there's no lack of clarity. And at that point, reporting in Starfish is where we would like this to go. And we would like this because when you go into Starfish, your students in your classes are all there. You don't have to load in any information about their, you don't have to remember their student number. You don't have to do anything. You just have to go to the student. You have to go to the button that says flag. The first thing that comes up when you press the flag button is academic integrity violation. When you click on that, it gives you two things. You just have to put the course context. So if you have a student who is in multiple courses of yours, and you have to make a comment. And here are the guidelines for what we would like to see in the comment box. We would not like to see a manifesto. We don't need pages and attachments and all of that stuff. It's great for you to keep those records, but what we need in the report is broad strokes what happened. I suspect that the student plagiarized a term paper, and I can prove it because they copied and pasted stuff from this article. Done. The nature of the assignment is good to have, whether this was a discussion post, was it the final exam, what scale are we talking about? did the student acknowledge responsibility? So this requires that you've had the conversation with the student, and frequently students are just going to say, yeah, I ran out of time, so I used ChatGPT on this. That's good to note. And ultimately, what penalty? I gave the student a 0 on the assignment. I failed the student in the class. I did whatever. Um, those first 4 bullets are the things that we really want on the violation report, and that's it. Uh, Remember that reporting doesn't require that you assess a penalty. We're trying to keep records so that if students are serial violators, we will be able to catch them. We have continued to work on the integrity policy for campus. The latest tinkerings on that are set to go to governance in the coming couple of days. Uh, Procedurally, there's nothing really different. We added a generic statement about use of generative AI, although larger forces are working on campus-wide things related to the nuance of that. The biggest thing in the policy that is that we basically removed connection with student conduct. In conversation with the student conduct office, we've determined that they don't want to be part of academic integrity. They view their role as different fundamentally than ours, and that's fine. So this just means that uh, we're not mentioning student conduct violations in the policy at this point. We'll mention student conduct again because the XE grade, XE grades are our ability to institute an institutional penalty against the student. So the uh, undergraduate catalog and perhaps the graduate catalog at this point has this language about the XE grades. It makes clear that an XE grade is a grade that has been earned because of an integrity violation. Uh, we would like to change the wording of this in the second paragraph to say that the XE designation may only be applied by student conduct in consultation with the academic associate deans. That's the way that we understand how this is going now and how we would like it to be applied. So basically, the associate deans go to student conduct and say, look, this student has done all of these things. We think it's time for the XE grade to be used. The important thing from the faculty side is you don't have to worry about this. You just have to police what's going on in your class and have faith that the associate deans who have the worldview of all of the violations that have happened over history will be able to do the right thing when students are serial violators. Um, I'm not even going to get into the AI use. It is a topic for a summit in and of itself, and rather just say we're here to help. If you have questions about any of this, please consult your local associate dean, and I will open it up for questions or for my fellow associate deans to tell me what I should have said.
I just wanted to add one thing that just a reminder that when you raise the flag in Starfish, the student does not receive that flag. So that doesn't count as you're notifying the student in writing. That has to be done separately. So I just wanted to point that out.
Thanks, Carol. That's a good point. The Starfish flags go to all of the associate deans. So when a student violates in the School of Ed, I'll see the flag as well. So it's another measure of accountability in terms of students not being able to sneak out just because they're in the School of Business. They're not going to get caught by someone in CLAS. They will get caught. Douglas has a raised hand. I acknowledge your raised hand.
So I'll just note that one of the things that the Committee on Academic Quality and Integrity will probably be working on this coming semester is updating the website that you shared, the intellectual integrity website, to reflect the latest changes in the policy, and also just to try to make it a more useful resource.
Excellent. As with lots of things, the web presence for much of this has lagged behind the actual work that's going on, but you know, so it goes. What else? We've got tons of time, a full 9 minutes. So Tim, you're convinced that if you have something like this happen in your class, that you know what you're going to do and you feel empowered to do it?
I feel confidently so. I think one thing that I as a relatively new faculty member, I just started in the fall, is to be a little bit more, you know, I used the Starfish program when I first for an intro class, but to, try to make sure I be more assertive with students and make sure that they do what, if I catch them doing something they shouldn't do. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's the AI part of this is, somewhat the elephant in the room, because I've been going through the last 2 semesters worth of violations, and the vast majority of them, somewhere in the report, will say something about, I suspect that the student used ChatGPT for this, or there's something about this. And most of the time, it's just that. It's, I suspect this. But occasionally, there are instructors who are saying, I ran this through a ChatGPT detector and it said 100%. So it's got to be made by AI. And I mean, it's just not that simple. And so although I want faculty to have the conversations with students about these things, and whether students are using these tools in ways that they shouldn't be, I think that's a separate thing. But having the conversation about, why did you do this? What might be positive or negative about using it? Those are, I think those are good conversations for us all to be having at this point. And just to say, you use this, you are bad, I'm punishing you, is really not, it's not the most helpful track. So we'll have 7 minutes.
Your PowerPoint was just too inclusive and all encompassing.
I do strive for accessibility.
I was a little late, so sorry if you already answered that question, but is Starfish now the only way to report, and that old form that used to be doesn't work anymore?
The old form still exists, and if you use it, we will still get those reports and they will go into our database. So there's nothing about using that form, at least as of today, that is verboten, but it's just easier. Starfish doesn't require you to put all the little ancillary information in, and I think from a reporting standpoint, it just makes things so much easier that it's it is the it's certainly the way to go. And we hope to get to the point where there's more uniformity and consistency in what people put in their reports, because, and I'll tell you, among the things that I've looked at over the last 2 semesters, they range from 2 lines total to in excess of 4 pages of crap that it's just not useful. So we're trying to do this so that it is easier, not so that it's just the same thing and it's more difficult. So, yeah.
Thank you.
One of the benefits to Starfish, in case it's not clear, is it actually brings in all the student information. So like their ID number and all that kind of stuff. So you don't have to like look all that stuff up because it's already there. So some of that part is really streamlined and does save a lot of time.
The other advantage of Starfish is also that it goes to all of the associate deans, whereas in Maxion, it just goes to this associate dean for where the course is housed, right? I think. So it's harder to see trends across courses possibly. I mean, it's just not as easy to manipulate, I guess, I would say.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's hard to know which associate dean to send it to. And so often in Maxion, it's sent to not the correct associate dean. And then in Starfish, we can all see it and we can make sure the right person has it.
Yeah, I mean, if you're teaching an HCI grad course, does that go to the Associate Dean of Graduate Studies, or does it go to the Associate Dean of CLAS where the course is instructed? If I'm the instructor, I have no idea what the answer to that question would be. So this way you don't have to think about it. It goes to all the people who can benefit from knowledge and none of the people who would not benefit from it.
Another
So, Paul, what
question.
oh,
Sorry.
sorry.
Would it make sense to report suspected use of AI, even if it's not going to have any consequences, just for the purpose of record keeping? And if you have a student and 10 instructors over time report, I suspected this student was using AI, that's saying something,
Yeah, and that is a case that we had this past semester where an instructor was virtually certain, in quotation marks, but really couldn't demonstrate it categorically. And so they didn't feel good giving the student a penalty on whatever the assignment was, but I urged them to put the report in. If they felt that strongly that this was something that the student was doing, the student didn't own up to it, but there was enough that was suspicious about it, then these records, and so there was a separate case where a student came to me and said, I got flagged for this. I didn't use AI. What is this going to do to my permanent record? And this is stuff that exists in it's not part of Banner. It's not part of record keeping that is likely to have any access to the outside world at any time. So if a student gets flagged for suspected use, there's no academic penalty, but their name is in the system. That's it. Their name is in the system. It's a closed system. And as long as they don't do anything that gets caught after that, then their life goes on and nothing becomes of it. But if they do something fishy in Management 261, and then they do something suspicious in English 102, and then they do something strange in EDU 210, 3 different courses and 3 different units, but we see them. And at that point, basically when we see a second offense, that's where we can step in. We can ask the student to come in and talk with us. We can send them a letter saying, you have done this in some variety of classes, and here's what's going to happen as a result of it. So it is valuable to have that information.
So Paul, can you forward me a copy of your slides, because one of the places where that old Maxion form exists is on the Intellectual Integrity website, and I won't wait for the committee to convene. I'll update that information.
Yeah, but on that, I should add that largely because of the organized mind of Rebecca Mushter, the policy, we have worked to try to remove things from the policy that are procedural and that are likely to change as, say, platforms change for storing records. So we're looking to have here are the steps that you should be taking as an instructor to, when you determine that a violation has occurred, separate from the policy, which should be, it should be lasting to the extent that things can be lasting in the ever-changing higher ed landscape.
That's Paul's way of saying that the policy is going to go through Curriculog momentarily, and that we're working on like the steps that are the procedures, that we'll have some wording for that, but I think stay tuned for that.
Yeah.
Okay, then what I'll do in the meantime is just.
Could you turn your microphone up so people can hear you better? Your volume is
Oh,
like a quarter of that of everybody else.
I'm sorry. I will just remove the old link for now, just to avoid confusion, and then we'll update the rest as it becomes available.
Sounds good. Well, we're a minute past our time, John. You're gonna have to cut us off.
No overtime pay.
Well, thanks for coming out.